The sky above the Grand Nexus Arena was not real. It shimmered with holograms, pulled from 100 different homeworlds. One corner held the pink clouds of Zoran Prime. Another rippled with the frozen auroras of Talrix 9. But all of it, all the color, the spectacle, the illusion, faded into irrelevance as the first drum sounded. Not a musical beat, a heartbeat. The arena itself was alive with noise. Rows upon rows of alien spectators roared from the stands, some pulsing with bioluminescent flashes, others vibrating in frequencies that only machines could record. There were no empty seats. Not tonight, not for this, because tonight, the undefeated warrior of Zoran, Commander Velra Zor, would take the stage again. And her opponent, a human, unknown, unranked, unarmored. A whisper spread through the crowd, first in curiosity, then amusement. Kael Riven, that was the name listed in the database. No clan, no house, no patron. He entered from the western gate, alone, wearing nothing but a black sleeveless G, his arms wrapped in faded cloth, no armor, no shield, and in his hands, 2 wooden sticks joined by a chain. The system called them Nunchucks. The crowd laughed. One of the broadcasters, a 4-eyed reptilian from Sector 9, wheezed through his mic. The human brings sticks. This is not a fight. This is a funeral. Kael said nothing. He walked slowly to the center of the arena, dust swirling around his boots. The sun lamps above cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. He stopped, bowed low toward the east gate, and then waited. The floor trembled. A door slid open, with a hiss like steam escaping a dying star. Commander Velra Zor stepped onto the field. Her armor gleamed silver and violet, each plate laced with kinetic fibers that could stop a missile mid-flight. Her blade hummed at her back, almost alive, and her helmet visor lit up with scanning overlays. She looked at Kael, then at his weapons, and smirked. "You came all this way to bring me kindling?" she said, her voice projected to every corner of the Colosseum. Kael did not answer. He spun his nunchucks once, a lazy motion, almost bored. Velra raised a brow. "You think this is discipline. You think this is tradition. This is war, human." Kael lifted his gaze. "I did not come to war," he said. "I came to teach." She laughed, long and loud. And when the signal horn blared, she activated her suit, her boots sparking against the stone as she surged forward like a blade released from a bowstring. The battle had begun. And somewhere in the crowd, the laughter began to die. Because Kael did not move like a man about to be broken. He moved like still water before a storm. The first blow should have ended it. Velra came down like falling thunder, sword drawn, armor flashing with power surges. Her kinetic blade, forged in the gravity furnaces of Zoran, could cleave armored drones in 2. Her strike was clean, brutal, unforgiving. Kael didn't block, he moved. A half step to the side. The blade missed his chest by a whisper and slammed into the stone beneath, sending shards flying like shrapnel. But Kael was already gone, gliding behind her with the quiet precision of a shadow that had waited a lifetime to move. The crowd gasped. Velra spun, faster than most eyes could track, expecting to find him off balance. He wasn't. Kael's nunchucks whirled once, not fast, smooth, controlled. The chain sang through the air with a rhythm older than the arena itself. It wasn't a weapon, it was a language. And Kael had spoken it so long, it had become an extension of thought. Velra's second strike came wide and fast, a sweep meant to crush. Kael ducked. His shoulder brushed the edge of her energy shield, close enough to singe fabric. But his posture remained untouched. As her momentum carried her forward, Kael twisted at the waist and released the first strike of the match. One stick, one arc. It connected with the back of her thigh plate. The sound it made was different. Not metal, not hollow, fracture. Velra stumbled, not from pain, from shock. Her armor's feedback system stuttered, and the HUD inside her visor flashed with an error she had never seen before. Localized structural weakness detected. She turned to face him fully now. The smirk was gone. "What did you do?" she demanded. Kael didn't answer. He stood straight, spinning the nunchucks in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A rhythm made for war, but not for destruction. Velra lunged again, this time switching stance, switching tactics. She jabbed with precision. Kael parried, not with force, but with placement. The wooden ends of his weapon tapped the edges of her strikes, redirected energy, guided fury into air. Then he struck again. A quick combination, left stick, upward flick, connecting with the underside of her left gauntlet. Right stick, downward snap, landing cleanly on her shoulder joint. 2 hits, tiny, almost delicate. But the lights on her armor dimmed, and warning beeps filled her helmet. "Impossible," she hissed. Kael finally spoke. "You built armor to defeat force, but not rhythm." Velra stepped back, chest rising, breath heavier now. The crowd had gone silent. Not even the broadcasters dared interrupt. The warrior who had won 57 consecutive arena matches had just been touched 3 times by a man with no armor, no enhancements, and 2 pieces of wood. Kael raised the nunchucks again, and this time his stance shifted. It was no longer defensive, it was instructional. Velra's voice was raw. "You think you can teach me?" Kael's voice was calm. "Number, but I can show you what they never taught you." She growled, rushed in again. And as her boot slammed down, Kael stepped aside, like he had seen it happen in a dream. Then he flicked his wrist, the chain wrapped gently around her wrist plate, and he pulled. She tumbled, flat, hard, face first, into the arena floor. A sharp crack echoed from her chest plate, and just like that, the first piece of her armor fell off. The arena floor cracked beneath her palms. Velra pushed herself up slowly, bits of broken armor sliding off her like dried leaves in a storm. Her shoulder plate hung loose, the seal at her elbow hissing from pressure loss. She blinked sweat from her eyes and tasted iron in her mouth. The silence from the crowd was worse than mockery. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching. Kael didn't press the attack. He stood in the same spot, breathing slow, twirling his nunchucks with a rhythm so calm it felt like he was meditating mid-battle. The chain danced in perfect arcs, whispering across the air with a sound not meant to intimidate, but to remind. He was still here, still steady, still choosing not to finish her. Velra's pride burned hotter than the pain in her ribs. She activated her suit's second-tier systems. The remaining armor plates flared violet, drawing from her core reserves. Sparks skittered across her frame as she surged forward, her blade trailing light like a comet. This time, she didn't aim to win. She aimed to shatter. Kael moved only at the last possible second. He ducked beneath her strike, spun low, and twisted in one fluid motion that brought both sticks upward, one clipping her ankle from below, the other snapping into the center of her spine plate. The momentum flipped her. She landed hard, gasping, her back arching on impact. Something cracked. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Kael didn't follow up. He took 2 steps back, a gesture of respect, or mercy. Velra rolled onto her side and spat blood. "You're holding back," she growled. Kael's voice was steady. "No." "Then why am I still breathing?" He looked at her, and his answer was simple. "Because I am not here to kill you. I am here to change you." Her breath caught, and for a moment the fight flickered, not ended, but paused. Velra sat up, her helmet cracked, her gauntlet useless. She unlatched the remaining pieces of armor one by one and let them fall to the ground. Breathless, unarmed, unhidden. "I have never fought without armor," she said, voice raw. "Not once." Kael bowed his head. "Then maybe now is the first time you're really fighting." She rose, wounded, bruised, bare, but standing. And the crowd, they rose with her, slowly, like waves, finding rhythm again. Not cheering, not mocking, witnessing. Kael raised his weapons once more, not to strike, but to offer. Velra took her stance again, this time with no weapon, only her hands. And when they charged each other again, it was not warrior versus warrior, it was truth versus pride. And when Kael swept her legs a final time, gently guiding her to the ground, she did not resist. She lay there, staring up at the arena's light, eyes blinking back something strange, not tears, realization. The bell rang, not in triumph, but in understanding, and the voice of the arena announcer, long silenced, finally spoke. Match over, victory. Kael Riven. Velra remained on the ground, arms wide, breathing hard. She looked toward him. Who taught you? Kael walked over and offered her his hand. She took it, and for the first time in her life, she bowed. The crowd did not roar. They stood. They stared. Not because Kael had defeated a champion, but because they had witnessed something no blade, no energy cannon, no hyper fist brawl had ever delivered. A surrender without humiliation. Velra Zor knelt on the stone floor of the Grand Nexus arena, her gauntlet shattered, her chest plate cracked, her shoulders bare. Kael stood beside her, offering his hand. She took it not as a loser, but as someone waking from a long, armored dream. As they stood together in the center of the ring, the lights above shifted, from crimson to gold, a rare color. A signal. Honor match. Velra turned to face the crowd. Her voice, still breathless from battle, was fed through the arena's comm system. It echoed across 100 worlds. I mocked this man. She pointed at Kael, then at his weapons, scuffed wooden nunchucks now resting across his back. I called his weapons toys, called his body soft, called his ways primitive. She paused, then looked at him. And I was wrong. Silence, then murmurs, then something more. The leaders of 5 planetary factions rose from their viewing boxes. The Chancellor of the Oran Collective leaned forward. The Empress of Zorath slid off her throne. Velra continued. He did not defeat me with brute force. He dismantled me with precision, with restraint, with something we forgot in the age of war machines and battle exosuits. She turned to Kael. Who taught you this? Kael looked into the crowd, not with pride, not with arrogance, but with clarity. My teachers had no titles, only patience, he said. They trained me not to conquer others, but to conquer myself. Velra's voice dropped low, almost a whisper. I want to learn. The arena gasped. A champion, a war general, a cultural symbol, asking to be taught by the man she had mocked. Kael bowed slightly. Then I will teach you what they taught me, not to fight for victory, but to fight with intention. At that moment, something shifted across the arena, not the lights, not the air, the belief. People didn't come to the arena of worlds to be humbled. They came to see destruction, to feed on spectacle. But now every pair of eyes saw the same truth. This was bigger than a fight. Kael turned and walked toward the edge of the arena. The gates slid open, not with sirens, but with silence. He paused before leaving and looked back. Velra was still standing there, watching him. Then she knelt, not from pain, but from choice, and pressed her fist to the stone floor, the salute of a warrior who had found something greater than dominance. She whispered the ancient warrior code, almost forgotten. He who controls the breath controls the storm. The phrase echoed, not through speakers, but through hearts. It rained on the upper decks of Zorath's capital spire, a rare phenomenon generated by atmospheric engineers to simulate the cleansing storms of Velra's homeworld. Most citizens avoided the downpour, not Velra. She walked alone through the rain, armor gone, blade left behind, soaked to the bone with each step echoing against the metal platform. She wasn't headed to the War Council, not to the training halls, not to the podium they had prepared for her return. She was looking for Kael, and she found him, beneath a covered terrace in the low quarter, where warriors without name trained in silence. No AI monitors, no spectating drones, just raw effort and dust. Kael was moving. His shirt was off, sweat and rain mingling as his nunchucks spun around his arms, across his back, over his shoulders. It wasn't fighting, it was flowing. Velra stopped just short of the mat, watching the rhythm, noticing how the weapon never lost momentum, how Kael's breath matched each motion, like a tide sink to a distant moon. He finally noticed her, didn't stop, just kept moving, voice calm. "You're late. I didn't know I was expected," she replied. "You're not," he said, "but you came anyway." She stepped onto the mat, slow and deliberate. "I didn't come to challenge you." "Good," he said. "I don't train for war, I train for clarity." Velra hesitated. "I want that." Kael stopped moving. The nunchucks dangled in his hand, then lowered to his side. "Then take off your titles," he said. "Your medals, your victories, your fear." "I'm not afraid," she said quickly. Kael tilted his head. "Then why are your hands clenched?" She looked down. They were. She let go. "I came to learn," she said quietly. Kael nodded. "Then first, learn to breathe." She exhaled, shaky. "Again," he said. Slower. She obeyed. They began with stands, no weapons, just feet against the mat, finding balance, not in the body, but in the mind. Kael spoke little, only when necessary. Velra fell, a lot. Her knee bled. Her pride stung. But she didn't stop. For the first time in her life, she was not training to be strong. She was learning how not to break. By dusk, she stood across from him again. Sweating, bruised, but standing taller. Kael tossed one of the nunchucks to her. She caught it. Awkward, heavy, unfamiliar. He smiled. "It's not the weapon you're holding," he said. "It's the story you're about to write." Velra stared at it. "This used to be a joke to me." Kael nodded. "That's because you were told power only comes from destruction." She looked at him. "And now?" He spun his own nunchuck once and replied, voice quiet. "Now you know power comes from control." She lowered her head slightly, not in defeat, but in humility. "Will you teach me again tomorrow?" Kael met her gaze. "No." She blinked. "Why?" He stepped past her, heading toward the shadows. "Because tomorrow you begin to teach yourself." And behind him, Velra Zor, the war goddess of 1,000 victories, stood on a silent mat in the dark, alone with a weapon she once mocked. And for the first time, she smiled. The galaxy does not forget its champions, and it certainly does not forgive their silence. Velra's refusal to reclaim her throne in the arena had become more than curiosity. It had become threat to the war councils, to the sponsors, to the media conglomerates who owned the broadcast rights to every bruise she used to deliver. They needed blood. They needed spectacle. They needed Velra to be violent again. So they gave her an ultimatum: return to the ring, face Kael Riven in a rematch, win or forfeit all honors, all standing, all legacy. The council chamber was full of false smiles when they delivered the demand. Kael was already present, his arms crossed, face unreadable. Velra walked in, wearing plain training robes, no armor, no makeup, no weapons. "You do not have to do this," Kael said softly. Velra looked at him, and for a heartbeat, something flickered. "I know," she said. But that night, the arena lights blazed again. The banners flew. The broadcast went live across 73 systems, and Velra Zor, the once legend, stepped into the ring opposite the man who had changed her life. But something was wrong. Kael saw it in her stance, in her eyes, in the way her fingers curled slightly at her side. She was hiding something. Then he saw it. A flicker of metal beneath her sleeve. An illegal energy dagger, the kind that phased through skin, not armor. He understood instantly. They had coerced her, threatened her, forced her to end this cleanly, quietly, by removing the threat they couldn't control. Kael. The bell rang. Velra moved first, too fast, too aggressive. Kael dodged but did not strike. She pressed harder. A sweeping kick, a low jab. Then the hand dipped, blade revealed. Kael caught her wrist mid-motion. Gasps filled the arena, but he didn't disarm her. He looked at her and said one word. Why? Her face cracked, just a little, and in that crack, a tear fell. They said if I didn't, they would erase everything. My records, my titles, my father's name. Kael let go of her wrist. The blade dropped to the ground between them. He turned to the arena walls, to the cameras, to the crowd, and he raised his voice, not with rage, but with clarity. You wanted a show, he said. You wanted blood. He pointed to the council box. But what you created is fear. He looked back at Velra. She was never your puppet. She is not your icon. She is herself. Silence swept the stadium, then movement. From the audience, people rising, not to fight, but to stand, one by one. From nobles to streetborn, aliens to humans, warriors to children. They stood. Velra dropped to her knees, not in defeat, but in relief. Kael walked to her, lifted her gently. You do not owe them anything, he whispered. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Then what do I do now? Kael's answer was simple. Speak. She turned, faced the entire arena, and with a voice still trembling but firm, she said, This was never about honor. It was about control. But I will not fight your war anymore. And in that moment, Velra Zor stopped being a champion. She became a rebel. News of the rematch spread across the stars like wildfire. But it wasn't the fight they remembered. It was the refusal. Velra's voice, broadcast live and uncensored, echoed across systems that had long stopped believing in truth. Her final words, I will not fight your war anymore, were replayed more than any arena victory in history. And Kael Riven, he became more than a fighter. He became a problem, a symbol too pure for the council to own, too dangerous to erase without exposing themselves. They summoned him days later to a high council chamber carved from starlight and steel, where monarchs and warlords projected their likenesses into floating rings of power. He walked in alone, no guards, no armor, just 2 wooden sticks on his back, and a calm that unsettled every one of them. Your influence spreads faster than protocol. One elder hissed. You are teaching weakness, another accused. Are you forming a rebellion? A third demanded. Kael looked at them without blinking. No, he said. I'm offering discipline. Discipline leads to resistance. Then your peace was never peace, Kael replied. Silence fell, until the Chancellor of Zoran, elder and bitter, leaned forward. Then what do you want, Kael Riven? Kael's answer was not long. I want a ship. Confusion flickered. The Chancellor narrowed his eyes. A ship? I want no armies, no funding, just a vessel. One I can fly to the outer worlds, to the corners of your empires where no one teaches, no one listens, no one believes in anything but survival. The Empress of Talrix whispered, You want to train the forgotten? Yes, Kael said. I want to train the ones you ignore. I want to teach balance, breath, strength that chooses not to strike. And if we deny you, Kael stepped closer to the center of the chamber. Then I will walk. Walk where? The Chancellor sneered. Kael's eyes held steady, wherever the silence is deepest. They watched him, not with hatred, but with fear. Because this wasn't a man anymore. This was an idea, a belief that one quiet soul could ripple across worlds, reshape what it meant to be strong, and do it without bloodshed. They granted him the ship, not out of charity, out of necessity. Because the truth was already loose in the galaxy, better to let him roam than to martyr him. So Kael departed with no fanfare, no anthem, just a simple message broadcast across his personal channel. If you've been called weak for choosing mercy, I will find you. If you've been forgotten, I will teach you. If you've been silenced, I will listen. I do not promise victory. I promise clarity, And that message was heard. The ship was small, unmarked, no banners, no shields, no weapons, just Kael Riven at the helm, and 2 wooden nunchucks hanging on the wall like memory. He flew not toward glory, but toward silence, outer moons, scavenger colonies, mining worlds left behind by empires, places where hope had been drained so slowly, people forgot it had ever existed. But he remembered. On the dust-choked world of Rizan 12, he found a boy with a cracked breathing mask practicing kicks in an alley. Kael showed him how to balance. On the shattered sky plate of Olinar, he met a group of former child soldiers who couldn't sleep without gripping a blade. He taught them to breathe. On a prison asteroid, once ruled by blood sports, he sparred blindfolded with lifers who had forgotten their names. One inmate wept after their match, not from pain, but because Kael had bowed to him after. No fame followed, but whispers did. Stories of a man who never raised his voice, of a teacher who could parry plasma with wood, of a fighter who taught people not how to win fights, but how to walk away from them. And back in the core worlds, governments tried to control the ripple. They banned the broadcasts. They scrubbed his name from record. They labeled him a pacifist provocateur, a threat to order. But it was too late, because ideas are not flesh. They do not bleed. They spread. In a slum on Varga Delta, a street girl broke up a gang fight with only her breath and 2 sticks made from scrap. On the temple steps of Cora Prime, an ex-commander taught his soldiers not to salute, but to bow. And in a hidden room, deep beneath the ruins of the Grand Nexus Arena, a group of children once trained for war whispered a chant, passed from one to another like fire in darkness. Breathe in calm, move with choice. Strength is stillness. And somewhere on a quiet moon, no one remembered. Kael sat cross-legged beneath alien stars, training a girl who had never seen a sunrise. Without fear, she swung her wooden sticks clumsily, fell, laughed, got up again. Kael smiled and said only one thing. You are already strong, you just need to remember. And her eyes, wild, burning, alive, reflected the sky. He would never rule, never command. But the galaxy was changing, not because of him, because of what he chose not to become. Would you follow a king? Or a teacher? Would you raise your fist or raise your breath? Tell us in the comments. What would you pass on if the world finally listened?